In this lesson, we will be talking about selection and selection tools. But first, it is important to understand what the selection is useful for. So, when we create a selection, it will constrain the editing or the transformation process that we do on an illustration. What does that mean? If we have some editing that we want to do, if we want to add some drawings or anything of that sort to one specific part of our illustration, we will use our selection tools. The selection tools we will find in our toolbar here on the left. It is these 8 tools here at the bottom, and you will notice them from their characteristic that their borders are created mainly from dashed lines. The first selection tool that we will see is the rectangular selection tool. So all we need to do is click on it and then click anywhere on our screen and start dragging. Once we release, you can notice how the border has these moving dashed lines. This is to show that the selection is active. So we can see right away by taking our freehand brush tool. If we start drawing now, and starting from outside here, we drag in, you will notice how we are drawing exclusively inside of our square. If we create another selection with our rectangular selection tool, right below, select our freehand brush tool and start drawing here. Even if I am physically going over the purple lines that I have just drawn, these lines will only appear within this rectangle that I have just drawn. As we saw in the previous lessons, how to create perfect squares or perfect circles by keeping our Shift key pressed, we can do the same with selections. So if we have a specific square, or if we want to create a selection in a specific square shape, all we need to do is click anywhere on our screen and we can start dragging and see how obviously the square is going in various directions. If we click our Shift key contemporarily, it will create a perfect square. So we can choose how big or small we want it, release, and now we have a perfect square selection. And notice how the previous selection has now disappeared. If we want the square to enlarge or get smaller from the center and not from where we clicked on the screen, all we need to do is click our Control key on our keyboard, and then you will notice how it is changing size from the center instead of from where we initially clicked on the screen. The same, we can contemporarily click our Shift key and have a perfect square that changes size from the center. We can also decide to move it in another position in our page. And we can do that by releasing the Shift and the Control and click our Alt key and move it around. So we can choose another position on the page and release there. And obviously then the previous selection will turn off. So all of this we can also do with our second selection tool, which is the elliptical selection tool. So we can select it. So we can start by clicking and dragging anywhere we want, like so. And then we can also draw again anywhere. So notice how it is covering the previous lines that I drew, but it isn't going outside of the circle. Again, we can also use our keyboard shortcuts for the elliptical selection tool. So we can click and drag, and if we select our Shift key, we will make a perfect circle. If we select our Control key, we can change the size of the circle from its center instead of from where we clicked on the screen. And if we click our Alt key, we can move our selection around. And again, by drawing inside, that the lines will only stay inside the selection. A very important thing to know once we arrive to this stage is how to deselect or deactivate a selection. So we have various ways of doing this. We have our keyboard shortcut, which is our Control key, our Shift key, and the letter A. all pressed contemporarily will deactivate or deselect a selection, as you can see. But we can go back, Ctrl Z. Another way to deselect it is by going to our drop-down menus here on top under the Select menu. And we can very easily click on Deselect. And notice how here on the right, it also shows the keyboard shortcut that I just mentioned, Ctrl, Shift, and the letter A. So we can click here, and again, our selection will be turned off. If we go back to our Select drop-down menu, we can notice that there are different keyboard shortcuts and different options that have to do with the selection. But we need to have a selection turned on to be able to access them. So we can Ctrl Z and just go back and have our selection activated again. And then we go to our Select drop-down menu and see how now these are possible. So the first option is Select All. This we didn't specifically need this selection to be turned on. Select All is to select everything that is inside our page, and it is Ctrl A. So let's click out, and we can also zoom out on our page. And now if we select Ctrl and the letter A contemporarily on our keyboard, you will notice how the whole page is selected. If we go back to our Select drop-down menu, we also see obviously deselect, which is what we just learned how to do, Ctrl, Shift, and the letter A. We also have the option of reselect, which is Ctrl, Shift, and the letter D. So we can do that by, first of all, we can go back. So let's click Ctrl Z and go back to the selection of our little circle here. And then we can try the reselect option. So Ctrl, Shift, letter D. So we can do this by, first of all, switching off this selection, and it is Ctrl, Shift, letter A. Selection is turned off. And now if we try typing on our keyboard Ctrl, Shift, letter D, the same selection will reappear. It will be selected again. So this is a very useful tool, because if we move on and we start doing other things, coloring, editing, whatsoever, and then we remember that we want to add more detail into the previous selection or the selection that we just had, all we need to do is click Ctrl, Shift, and the letter D. The other options we have under our Select drop-down menu are also Invert Selection. This is also a very useful option, and we can use it by clicking on our keyboard Ctrl, Shift, and the letter I. So if we go on our page, zoom out, and click on our keyboard Ctrl, Shift, and the letter I, notice how now the borders of our page are selected, and we still have this border selected. But that means that the selection isn't within the circle anymore, but it is outside of the circle. So now everything outside of the circle is selected, and I can show by drawing again. Let's take another shade. Now if I go over this circle, start clicking outside, notice how I'm able to color and paint all the way outside of the circle, but it doesn't go inside. So this is also a very useful tool if you want to create edits or any transformations on everything except for one specific part. But now let's go on and see the other selection tools that we have here on the left. To make it easier to understand these tools, I have opened up the file that we worked on previously in one of the other lessons. And now we can try out these other selection tools, and we can try them out on this illustration. So the first one that we're going to see is the Polygonal selection tool. This one works very similarly to the line tool. So it is a click, 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 and then you release. So for example, we can try it out on one of these mountains. Let's select the last mountain here, and you can start by clicking on one edge, clicking here. You can click at the top. There's a little curve here, so we will click a few times. Then you can drag it all the way down. We also have a curve underneath here, so it won't be a perfect circle because this creates straight lines. But we can click, 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 and then join it at the end. So now notice how the whole edge of this mountain is selected. It isn't perfect. You can notice here because the selection tool uses straight lines, but it is a very easy way to select shapes. It is a perfect selection tool if you are working with very geometrical shapes, so something architectural like buildings almost. So once we have this selected, for example, so by doing this we could create a very easy highlight. So we can take a brush and start creating a little shade like this. So notice how the highlight only happened on the inside of the selection. Notice though that when I did this, I created it on the same level as this mountain. Another option that we could have is creating the selection inside a new layer so that we can keep our previous layer, just the mountain, perfectly the way it is, and then we can create all the transformations, highlights, and so on in a different layer. So let's make that example. First of all, let's go back by clicking Ctrl Z. Then here in our layer panel, we will create a new layer, and we can call this highlights. So with this layer selected, I will, to make sure, deselect the selection that we had activated with Ctrl-Shift-A and create a new selection. So we have our polygonal selection tool selected and we will start clicking. Again, we will make a very fast selection all the way around. It will definitely not be perfect, but all we need to do is make an example and we're just adding a little bit of a highlight. So we arrive to the edge, select, and our selection is done. We already have our color chosen, so we can click on our freehand brush tool and create this sort of highlight here. So now we can Ctrl-Shift-A, deselect, but we can always turn off and turn back on our highlights or even delete them if we want. So now let's go see the other selection tool, which is the freehand selection tool. And we can try this again on a new layer, so we make sure that we don't touch the original drawing. And we will try it on the second mountain. So the difference with this one is it isn't a click and release selection tool. This one you start clicking and then you never release the mouse. You just go all the way around and continue. So it isn't perfect and it is hard to be perfect with this tool, but there are ways to fix it up later on, which we will see. But for now, let's just continue. We just keep dragging our mouse and bring it to the edge. So you can notice how it definitely is not perfect, but we just need it for now as an example. So what we can do in this case is create another highlight. So we can take our freehand brush tool and again start dragging and creating a very simple highlight shape. Ctrl-Shift-A and see how we have these two highlights now on our mountains. So this selection tool that we just used, the freehand selection tool, is a lot easier to use for organic shapes. So let's go ahead and see some other ones. So we can try the Contiguous selection tool. This one is great because it goes off of pixels, so off of color. So we can decide that we want to select this mountain, for example. We click on the layer for safety and then select. And notice how it selected the whole shape perfectly. And note that this isn't just because it is on one layer, but for example, I will just create another shape very quickly on this layer and go like this. If I take our Contiguous selection tool and select the mountain, you can notice perfectly how it only selects the mountain and it hasn't touched this new part at all, even though it is on the same layer. But we can go back now and only select our mountain and we can create another highlight on this one. So we can select another shade and again start from the top and create this highlight. So we can deselect for now, Ctrl-Alt-A, and we can start looking at the other tools. The similar color selection tool is very useful as it chooses everything within the page that has the same color. So we can use this as an example with the sun. So if we were to create other circles in our layer, but using the exact same color, so we can use our color picker tool, and it has appeared here now. And then we select our circle tool and create different shapes around. Now when we go and select our similar color selection tool and click only on the sun, notice how it has selected all the other colors as well. So this is great if you are selecting very detailed things inside of an image. It could be flowers, it could be little details, and if they're all the same color, you don't need to go and select each one, but this tool will be very helpful to select all of them contemporarily. Bezier curve selection tool, which is very similar to our polygonal selection tool, but this one is very useful as if you are selecting, it is always a click and release selection method, like so, click, release, click, release, click, release. But if you have more curved shapes like this one, for example, you can click and without releasing, if you move the mouse, you can create a curve. So this is very handy to be able then to get a more perfect selection. So then once you have the curve that you like, you release and you can continue selecting. Notice how it will create this curve now. We can get rid of that by double clicking here and it will close up our shape. Another selection tool that we can see is the magnetic curve selection tool. So this one is also very useful as it automatically perceives curves. So if we select, for example, maybe let's select another paint layer. So it is always a click and release tool, but it will pick up on all of the little pixels. So we can continue. This isn't perfect, so you need to do it slowly, but notice how it follows roughly all the pixels of our shape. So we can go pretty easily all the way around by clicking and releasing, clicking and releasing. Continue clicking and releasing, and again hit enter and it will have selected the shape. So we can take now, for example, our freehand brush tool and create a shade on the other side of our mountain, and then start from the top and create a rough shade here on the bottom, and Ctrl Shift A and we have deselected. So now that we have seen all the main selection tools, we can also see how to combine them and use them together to create better selections. So notice how these aren't that perfect. There are ways of combining the selection to make them perfect. So for example, let's say we want to fix up this selection here. So we could first go ahead and use our polygonal selection tool, go back on this highlight, so it was highlight 2, and start selecting. Then create a very rough selection around this side. So let's say that now we want to fix this side of the selection, or we want to fix this part more. We could also select another tool, another selection tool, and by clicking the Shift button, we can add to the selection. So we can do that by first selecting our Shift key on our keyboard and then clicking on our screen. So we can do something like this and then closing it up here. So notice how now we have added some and we have created this little curve here on the bottom. So always select the Shift key first. So let's say I don't need any of this here. Now, instead of the Shift key, we'll select the Alt key, and then I will start drawing around here and then selecting around what we have drawn already. And notice how I have deleted part of the selection. So we can take our eraser tool here at the top. We have the highlights selected. Click our freehand brush tool, make the size a bit smaller, and invert our selection. So invert selection, Ctrl Shift I. This way now we can go and cancel everything that is outside of the selection that we don't like. So here also, for example. And then we can invert the selection again, Ctrl Shift I, take the same color that we had, take our freehand brush tool and fill in all the parts that are in the selection. So notice how we will have a more perfect and more precise selection. So we can do the same on this part here. We can take our contiguous selection tool, select this shadow that we created, which is here, and then we can select our shift key and select a different selection tool like the freehand selection tool. So from here we can add this part, for example. Always remember to close it. This little section here, we can move down in our page and see that this isn't selected. So again, first click the shift key and then start drawing. And if we make a mistake, all we need to do is click our Alt key and take out the bits that we don't need. So like this one, for example, and here, for example. Again, we can keep moving down. Notice what we need. So let's select our shift key and select this part. Let's keep moving down. And here we can cancel this part out. So our Alt key and start creating little sections, which is what I consider to be the easiest way to clean selections up. Make it a little bit cleaner here and also here. So now that we have done this, we can first fill in this selection a bit better. So we can take our color selector tool, select our color, then select the freehand brush tool and fill in this part quickly, all the parts that we missed previously. And then we can do an invert selection. So Ctrl-Shift-I, take our eraser and erase the parts that we don't want. You can do this all the way around and clean up the bottom. So notice how easier and more precise now our selection is and how easier it is to create shadows, shapes, and any drawing of any kind. So again, Ctrl-Shift-A to deselect, and notice how much cleaner this is now. It is also possible to create intersecting selections. That means that we can drag, for example, a square on one side, so a square selection here. Selecting Shift, create a circle over here. Now we have a joined selection. But to create an intersecting selection, all we need to do is click Shift and Alt contemporarily. So Shift and Alt on our keyboard and then drag a shape. Notice how now the selection is the overlapping of the two previous selections. So this can also be very useful if you want to select very particular shapes. Another way to access to all of these options is by going into tool options. So if we click on this panel here on the right, you will see here under action all of these different options. So we have replace, intersect, add, subtract, and symmetric difference. So for example, I want to select the sun. So I will take any tool, maybe this similar color selector tool to select the sun and click on the red layer. So we can select here, we can create a shade on the sun. And this is with the replace action selected. If we were to select intersect and take another selection tool, intersect is still selected, and then drag over it, notice how now the intersection of both selections is what has been left selected. We can also try the add one. So now we could add onto the bottom, for example. So now all of this part is selected. And we could also create another shade in this case. Let's choose another color. Let's go for a darker shade of red and create a little shade on the bottom of our sun. And be careful not to come out on this side because it will color always inside of the selection. We can click again on our selection tools and go back to tool options. And here we can see subtract, which is what we saw with the shortcuts also. So here we could use, for example, our freehand selection tool and decide that we don't want any of this selected. So we take it away and we have subtracted all of this from it. And then we have the symmetric difference. So if we select this and choose another tool, for example, and now drag our circle here, it will add both options. But if we try drawing inside of that, notice how it would only draw in the difference between the two shapes. So notice how it draws in the little sections. But for now, we can go back and clean it up a bit. And we can also deselect, Ctrl-Shift-A. So these are the main selection basics and selection tools that you can use. You can go in detail and try them all slowly to get more perfect selections, but they do make the drawing process a lot easier and a lot faster, as you can see, to create details. So for today, we can end here. Thank you for following along. If you have liked this video, make sure to leave a like, and if you have any questions or suggestions, make sure to leave them in the comment box. Also, if you want to support the channel, make sure to subscribe, and that way you can stay updated on any news and any new videos. See you in the next video.